Thanks again for coming out on this dreary Thursday night, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Ethics and the UM Philosophy Department, many representatives here, it's my honor to present Professor David Sherman and a panel on his latest book, Camus. Now, Professor Sherman, as well as being a draw to the philosophy department, I know many a wayward student has come to become a philosophy major on account of his passion and charisma. But he's also an accomplished scholar. Previous works, including Sartre and Adorno, The Dialectic of Subjectivity, co-edited the Black Velvet Guide to Continental Philosophy with Robert Solomon, and worked with Leo Rausch on Hegel's phenomenology of self-consciousness. And the distinguished colleagues that joined me here tonight are presented in the order in which they will present. Paul Lynch, Fred McGlynn, Deborah Slicer, and Albert Wolfman. And just so the audience knows, each professor will have about 7 minutes to give a presentation on Professor Sherman's book. Professor Sherman will have some time for response, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. And as Dane mentioned, he will be moderating to try and keep things moving. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Sherman and our students.
Everybody hear me okay? Great. So it's really nice to be here. It's great to get to honor David, and this is a fascinating, interesting book. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, hope you'll go out and buy copies, and maybe you can even get him to sign it. My job is to give you a basic overview of this book. It's very rich, very complex. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do justice to it in my 7 minutes, so we'll see how far I get. The way that David begins the book, I think, is quite helpful. It's a quote from Camus in which he denies that he is a philosopher or an existentialist. He's not sure whether he's an intellectual or not, and he does admit that he supports left-wing politics, but he says it's in spite of himself and as well as the politics he supports. So there's an interesting question that is raised by this, which is what to make of Camus. What sort of thinker is he? Was he a philosopher or not? David argues, I think quite convincingly, that understood in the right way, Camus is clearly all of these things. He's someone who, in one sense, is working on the margins of philosophy, someone who's more taken with ancient Greek philosophy than the German philosophy that was the rage of the day, although he is taken with Nietzsche. That's one exception. He explores his philosophical topics, interestingly, through all sorts of different kinds of writing: treatises, novels, plays, essays, and I think, as David brings out in his book, one of the things that maybe is guiding him throughout is that he's always trying to remain true to concrete experience itself, refusing to systematize it. He also notably was someone who edited a work called Combat during World War II when the Nazis were occupying France. So this was somebody who not only was engaging in all sorts of philosophical discussions and debates, but was really putting himself on the line at some pretty challenging times in his life. He was a lifelong opponent of the death penalty, known maybe best as somebody who characterized the human condition as absurd, but also someone who was an unwavering humanist. So one of the paradoxes or one of the challenges that runs throughout his writings that David is very interested in is how does Camus reconcile his views about the absurd with his commitment to an ethical and political solidarity that he shares with the rest of humankind. He received the Nobel Prize, many of you may know this, in 1957 when he was 44. And the thing that, sort of the single quality maybe that David singles out in his book that is going to run as a current throughout Camus' writings is there's a rare intellectual honesty and ethical courage that you can find in Camus as a thinker, that you find both in the way that he lived and in his various writings. The book the way that David has laid out his book is organized in terms of Camus' ideas. So it doesn't strictly follow the chronological order in which he wrote these things, although there is a fairly close parallel between the two. I think in broad terms you could say that there's a move in how Camus' ideas develop from a more theoretical, metaphysical standpoint, which tends to focus on how the individual as a solitary human being might respond to, in a kind of gesture or attitude of revolt, to this idea of the absurd. And he moves from those sorts of concerns to in his later writings to a more explicit focus that is more practical in nature, that looks at ethical and political questions. And one of the actually interesting criticisms that David develops in the book is to argue that some of the metaphysical views that Camus has about the absurd he thinks are untenable, and that actually if we could sort of shed the metaphysical baggage, that the ethical views that are lying there and maybe aren't as fully worked out as they might be have a lot more going for them. Now, in this first part of the book where he's focusing on these metaphysical questions, he's looking at classic works like The Myth of Sisyphus, The Stranger, The Fall. And the way he lays it out is to sort of first look at just the theoretical characterization of the absurd, which is, as you might guess, difficult to characterize. He notes that this is something that is both an experience and a concept, and that there's an interplay between these. Basically, it's Camus' attempt to characterize what he calls, or at least David characterizes as, a divorce between the mind or consciousness and the world. There's a sense that there is a problem that things that we find meaningful or that we find of value, we typically want to be grounded by the world. These things do not, according to Camus, are not. The sort of fundamental absurdity of the world means that any meaning that we're going to have in our lives is going to have to be created by human beings. But that's not something we find easy to cope with. There's a sort of recoil from that gap between an empty, absurd world and our human condition. This is something that David characterizes as a kind of God's eye view when you're looking at the idea that there's this gap, but there's no God anymore, because as we know, Nietzsche made clear God has died. He says in more secular terms, more recent literature, this is akin to what Nagel has called the view from nowhere. Now, as I've noted earlier, David rejects Camus' metaphysical conception of the absurd and thinks that while there are insights there, it's better understood in phenomenological terms. That's something perhaps that Professor McGlynn will address in more detail, or David himself. Now, the latter part of that discussion, this theoretical portion of Camus' writings, is a focus on some of his different novels. And David argues that some of the main characters in these novels represent sort of purified, idealized types who are trying to respond to this condition of the absurd that we find ourselves in and are failing. They're adopting strategies that are existentially tempting, but that they're not actually viable as ways of living. Just briefly, in the case of the stranger, the main character, Merceau, is someone who, David says, personifies the extreme of lived experience. So somebody who unreflectively tries to immerse themselves in life. On the other hand, we have the Fall. The main character, Clémence, personifies a purified extreme of reflection. So in both cases, in one case they're trying to solve this problem of the absurd by immersing themselves in life. In the other case, by, in a sense, distancing themselves from life and trying to conceive of themselves solely as reflection. David argues that neither of these strategies work and that they both actually are examples of Sartrean bad faith. In the one case of Merceau, someone who's trying to basically deny that he has the power of transcendence, the power to take responsibility for himself, basically to form a self. Whereas in the case of Clémence, he seems to be someone who wants to deny that he has a history, that he has a past, that he has facts that partly determine what he is. Neither of these strategies, David argues, will enable the individual to bridge that gap between consciousness and the world, but he thinks that partly what's valuable about these novels is that it really helps bring to life the various possible responses that the modern condition allows us. How am I doing on time? A minute, okay. All right, well, briefly, in the second half of the book, there is a shift to the practical, ethical, political strain in Camus' thought. Here, David argues that Camus partly sets aside the metaphysical question of whether the absurd is what it is, and tries to address the question of, well, given that, how might we solve this problem? If these solitary individual attempts to bridge that gap don't work, what else do we have? He says that this is where Camus moves to a focus on what he calls solidarity, and the idea that only through collective action, through a focus on creating meaning among the community, there'll be a kind of response to the absurd that is genuine. Let's see. Let me just say one other thing before I completely run out of time, which is that in the process, what really emerges in the book is that in addition to being a philosopher of sorts and a novelist, is Camus just being this politically active person, somebody who's on the front line, somebody who's willing to put his neck on the line, if you like. And that really, I think, comes clear throughout the book that for David, it's important that we just appreciate that partly what's distinctive about him is what an extraordinarily decent and courageous person Camus was, and how that has to be part of what we think about when we're trying to determine what sort of philosopher he is and whether or not he's a philosopher for our times. I'll stop there.
I have a somewhat more modest task. Can you all hear me? Is this on? Commenting on the absurd itself, and I would like to say as a preliminary issue, this, although those of you who know me may think it is true, this is not a case of typecasting for me to speak of the absurd. David recognizes that the notion of the absurd has two distinct meanings for Camus. First, a metaphysical meaning. Here he must deal with the problem of the loss of a unifying, overarching meaning to the question of existence. Camus and David both recognize that this is a problem posed by the death of God. The problem with this approach, as David properly sees, is that it poses a metaphysical question of ultimate meaning which cannot be answered, because it requires us to move to what he calls the view from nowhere, which no human being can ever effectively occupy. You cannot answer the meaning of the totality because you can never get outside of the totality in order to understand it. Camus rails against the religious existentialists, Kierkegaard, Chestov, and Jaspers, who use reason to argue the limit of what reason can offer in the way of an ultimate justification for the meaning of life, and then, when reason comes up against its own limitations, leap to God as the answer, assuming that we take Jaspers' notion of the encompassing, which reveals itself at the moment of shipwreck of reason, as another name for God. Kierkegaard recognizes the rationality of the leap of faith, but seems, at least to Camus, to argue that this leap is necessary if we're to avoid madness. Chestov says that for most things reason will do, but not for the question of ultimate meaning. Since he believes that ultimate meaning is necessary, therefore we must believe in God, because he alone can answer to what reason cannot answer. These responses are, for Camus, all examples of what he calls humiliated reason. That is, using reason to argue to the point where reason cannot answer to our need, and then seemingly to argue that therefore reason must surrender to faith. He wants, he says, Camus wants, to know whether he can live only with what he knows. For him, lucidity is the issue. David argues, rightly I believe, that Camus never fully escapes this problem of the metaphysical view from nowhere. Camus was an ex-Catholic who perhaps was inevitably forced to think within what David calls the shadow of God, whether God is present or absent. David properly recognizes that even if we suppose God, we still cannot answer the question of the view from nowhere. If we do suppose God with all those attributes which the Christian tradition has bestowed upon him, then we're still confronted with the absurd, because a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, all good, and the creator of everything cannot explain the suffering of the innocent, the existence of evil, and the general incomprehensibility of the universe. The second sense of the absurd, the phenomenological, David recognizes as a more fruitful approach to Camus' thought. While recognizing the shortcomings in his philosophic thinking, which derive from his inability to fully escape from the metaphysical question posed in the shadow of God, Camus' attention to the lived experience of the absurd as a general problematic for his generation, living out the death of the Enlightenment and existing in the ominous shadow of the impending disaster which will be World War II, resonates strongly for the reader, particularly at the time of its publication, but also in the aftermath of the war, which never ended but just morphed into the Cold War. The problem of the absurd from the phenomenological point of view is posed in the question, how can I live? Here Camus offers several types of existence: the seducer, the conqueror, the actor, and the creator. And for Camus, they must all be lucid seducers, conquerors, actors, and creators. It's clear that Camus' preference is for the creator. He seems to agree with Nietzsche's statement that man invented art lest he perish from the truth. In the face of the absurd, it is an experience. What interests Camus is what issues from it. For Camus, the answer is revolt, freedom, and passion. He preferences the creator over the seducer and the conqueror, but he still seems to admire the lucidity with which the seducer and the conqueror can undertake their tasks. Camus argues, weakly, as David recognizes, that in the face of the absurd, the question is not the quality of life, but the quantity of life. This is clearly an answer which in the long run will not satisfy us, and certainly ends up not satisfying Camus. But at this point, maintaining lucidity and rebellion against the absurd seems to be for him an end in itself. David recognizes that part of Camus' problem is that he begins with a Cartesian view of consciousness, the lucid mind confronted with the silence of a world which cannot answer its fundamental questions of meaning. David argues that without a context of historically situated intersubjective relations, posing the question of meaning, particularly moral meaning, becomes impossible. Here I would delve into a personal aside. David prefaces his discussion of the absurd with a citation from Beckett's Endgame, my favorite playwright and my favorite play. Both Beckett and Camus work out their literary enterprises from a fundamental experience of the absurd. But unlike Camus, Beckett always poses these issues in an intersubjective context. There are always at least two characters undergoing this experience: Didi and Gogo, Ham and Clove, Winnie and her husband, And even in his solo character plays, Crap and Not I, there's still another involved. Crap's earlier life, which he listens to on tape, and Not I's silent auditor who shrugs every once in a while when she's misconstruing herself. What generates an incipient meaning in these works, which belies their seeming nihilist premises, is the subtle interactions between the characters which generate inexplicably, but also undeniably, what Ham suggests may be, quote, a great compassion, unquote. Camus' early anti-heroes, Meursault and Clemence, seem far too solipsistic to ever be able to escape from their own self-involvement. What surprises me, and a point that I don't think David takes up explicitly, is why Camus, of all people, would have taken hold of this Cartesian position on consciousness. Yes, I know all French philosophers are raised, on the mother's milk of René Descartes. But Camus grew up in the Mediterranean. He is wedded to his body and its senses. His favorite story of Sisyphus, for example, is that once Sisyphus returned to the earth to chastise his wife for not burying him, it was the sun upon his face and the feeling of the sand beneath his feet which consumed him. He forgot his vengeance in the pure joy of carnal existence. Camus' answer to the question of meaning, apart from his later development of a social ethic, again and again came down to his pure joy in carnal experience. In Return to Pasa, when he goes home to the Mediterranean after World War II to regain again, he says, that wellspring of life which had once been his and which he'd lost in the war, and he fails the first time and goes back to dark Europe with its rainy mentality, but returns again because he must. And on an early morning, he climbs the wall of the beach and looks out over the sand with two Arab boys playing in the sand, and knows then and rediscovers what he was looking for. He utters that memorable phrase when he encounters a sunrise over the Mediterranean, which one of his biographers used as a title then for their biography of him. He says, "I knew then that I had within me an endless summer." I agree that there's a need to recognize intersubjective experience, but I've always been puzzled that even at this early stage in his career, Camus did not recognize that his consciousness, as is all of ours, is incarnate. That is not to suggest that the acknowledgement of the body necessarily answers the experience of the absurd, but it does bridge the gap which otherwise exists between consciousness and nature, which David recognizes Camus always wishes to put on his side in any argument about meaning. That was less than 7 minutes, wasn't it? You don't know how hard that is for me.
Hi, I'm Deborah Slicer. I teach philosophy and literature, and sometimes I write about philosophy and literature. So I'm going to talk about Camus' philosophy and literature in 7 minutes. Paul mentioned that some question whether Camus was a philosopher, and I don't doubt that he was a philosopher, and David's book, having read it, made me think he was probably a great philosopher, and I really enjoyed reading the book for that and other reasons. But I'm wondering if Camus was a great novelist, and I'm going to raise those sorts of questions for David and for Camus. Here's what Camus said in his review of Sartre's first novel, Nausea. This is Camus. "A novel is never anything but a philosophy expressed in images. And in a good novel, the philosophy has disappeared into the images. But the philosophy need only spill over into the characters and action for it to stick out like a sore thumb, the plot to lose its authenticity, and the novel its life. Nonetheless, a work that is to endure cannot do without profound ideas, and the secret fusion of experience and thought, of life and reflection on the meaning of life, is what makes the great novelist. The novel in question, which is Nausea, is one in which this balance has been broken, where the theories do damage to the life. Obviously, Camus, like Sartre, is drawn to images, to the novel, as he explores the metaphysical absurd and as he explores the phenomenological experience of the absurd. And he's obviously aware, at least as a reader and as a critic, that the images have to do the work. That once the philosopher-novelist starts to philosophize, to argue, to tell rather than show, though I really don't like that old saw for reasons I'll explain in a minute. Once that starts to happen, the whole project goes down the tubes. Martha Nussbaum, a contemporary philosopher who writes very, very well about philosophy and literature, says something relevant here. She is in Love's Knowledge and in other places is critical of elaborate and contrived philosophers' examples that try to pass themselves off as literature. And they fail for at least two reasons, and here they are. Number one, schematic philosophers' examples almost always lack the particularity, the emotive appeal, the absorbing plottedness, the variety and indeterminacy of good fiction. They lack, too, good fiction's way of making the reader a participant and a friend. So that's number one. And number two, we can add that philosophers' examples, which set things up schematically, signal to the readers what they should notice and find relevant. They hand them the ethically salient description and solutions. This means that much of the ethical work is already done, the result cooked. This could be, I'm thinking, what Camus believes Sartre has written, a schematic philosopher's example, something that's cooked. And he's rightly critical of Sartre if that's what Sartre's done. What a successful novel does versus a philosopher's example is, among other things, according to Nussbaum, number one, it shows us, number two, characters struggling with non-commensurable, conflicting moral goods. Three, the novel doesn't just show, and this is why I don't like that old cliche about showing instead of telling. The novel doesn't just show, but it requires readers to grow their own moral capacities as we struggle along with these characters. Number four, the characters have emotional depth, and they help us as readers become emotionally intelligent. Number five, the novels follow the small movements of the inner world, to quote Proust. Number six, their diction, their metaphors, their images, their pacing, their cadences, as well as, and importantly, their silences, are all very carefully chosen, are all very carefully crafted to convey the difficulty, the extreme difficulty at times of moral life when it's really interesting. And I wonder if Camus' novels really meet his own standard, which is, as he puts it, pretty minimal compared to what I've just laid out here, if they really show via images. And I'm not even altogether sure sometimes what he means by images, but whether they do show via images, and whether they meet, or much less meet, Nussbaum's standards. David mentions Robert Solomon's comment that Meursault in The Stranger is a, quote, philosophically fantastic character by virtue of his being selfless, metaphysically, not morally. And I was interested in that. That really caught my attention. We could say the same about Hamlet, depending on how you read Hamlet, whether he's the soul who's adrift or the conniver, but I see him as adrift mostly through much of the play. So we could say the same about Hamlet, that he's metaphysically selfless through much of the play, or say the same of Leslie Marmon Silko's Teo in her novel Ceremony. But these are not only metaphysically selfless characters, they're also, interestingly, characters with histories, characters with rich and conflicted emotional lives, characters with complicated motives, and characters with very, very challenged identities, which is in part why they're selfless metaphysically. And I can't really say that of Meursault. And I was struck by what it was either David or Fred, or Paul or Fred said about what did they call it? Oh, about some of these characters being rarefied extremes. That's how they struck me. And interestingly, I'm neither, and David sort of mentions this about Meursault, I can't identify with him, and I'm not repelled by him either. And I don't know, that signals trouble for me. So I wonder if by the fantastic Solomon also means that Meursault is sort of unreal, a product of the imagination solely and not of life, whether he is one of these rarefied extremes that one would find in philosophers' examples versus, to my mind, truly great literature. Which again leads me to believe that Camus didn't hold himself to the same standards that he was holding Sartre to in the review that I read. So I wondered if you might comment on that. It looks like you're going to comment on a lot of things I've said. You're busy scratching away. So I wondered if you might comment on that, and I wondered if you might comment on the following. I have not read that collection of short stories that you mention in the, I think, last chapter of your book. So, and I take it when Camus wrote those stories, his humanistic tendencies were just more at the forefront for him, and I'm wondering if they were kind of a different kind of fiction, more in line with the sorts of standards that Nussbaum's putting out there for something being really fine literature. That's it.
I'd like to say something about the spirit and about the structure of Camus' philosophy. As for the spirit, against the background of contemporary American philosophy, it's stunning in its passion, in its vigor. The way these people, he and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, worried about the great problems of the day, the wars, the injustices, the future of the working people. And the spirit, I think, is alive in David's book and in David's philosophy, but it's largely absent in contemporary American philosophy. Of course, passion can become a rancor, and Sartre in particular wielded a sharp and lacerating pen. But as American philosophers have shown, you can be rancorous without being passionate. As for the structure, it exhibits many features and lines, and the ones that David traces are essential both to Camus' work and to our situation today. He begins with the absurd, and as we heard, the absurd is essentially the experience that the overarching moral framework has collapsed, and there's nothing to replace it. And then the way that David traces these lines is always a three-cornered affair. It's Camus, some great contemporary or predecessor, such as Sartre, Marx, Heidegger. And then, of course, there's David's voice. But he also engenders a conversation between Camus and what today are the standard versions of ethics, the ethics of pleasure and prosperity, what we call utilitarianism, the ethics of rights and liberties, what we call deontology, and then virtue ethics, Blessed be the self-explanatory name. and David raises the question, how does Camus react to the experience of the absurd? Is he a utilitarian? Not really. Is he a rights and liberties person? And David thinks that there is a very thin and somewhat cramped residue of deontology in Camus' categorical rejection of not only the death penalty, but of any killing whatsoever. But what he gradually moves towards is virtue ethics and the better kind, which is not centered on the virtuous person as the source of what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, but on the virtuous action. And the way that David shows us Camus getting there is first by way of what he calls a phenomenological ethics, which is concerned with three themes: understanding, happiness, and the reduction of human suffering, which David rightly calls thin. And then he moves to the thicker virtue ethics in what's called the agent-focused variety, which is, in a sense, the continuation of phenomenology, because it is centered on what's out there by way of intrinsically virtuous good actions and those that are unacceptable. And I think the way that David has traced this line puts before us the task that today we as philosophers face, and I think that we as a society face. The addition that I would make is this: I think we cannot do just with the virtue ethics that concentrates on the concrete, on the person, and on the community. We do need a rights and liberties framework which first makes it possible to focus and center one's lives on this concreteness in a defensible and sustainable way. So we need a richer deontology, something like the Rawlsian framework of justice as fairness. But that, I think, I agree with David, would be too thin. It lacks sufficient content. And I think the content is to be found just in the way that Camus finds it and that David points us to, and that's the concreteness, the small-scale concreteness of life, both in the communities that have still survived and in the beauty of nature that has survived. And so content will finally come, I think, from the inconspicuous human communities and the unpretentious beauty of nature. And David concludes his book by raising, rhetorically perhaps, the question whether Camus is a philosopher for our time. And I think with David's help, I think we can see that the answer would be yes.
How much time do I have?
You have about 15 or 20.
Okay. Well, let me take one of them just to thank a number of people. Firstly, Dane, thank you for putting this on, authorizing it. And this is the second time you've done this for me.
Keep writing books.
Thank you. That's the plan. And secondly, I would mention one of the things that Camus writes about and he deems important are what he calls vital traditions. And happily, I can say that I myself am part of a vital tradition that is the philosophy department at the University of Montana, from retired colleagues with whom I worked years ago to younger colleagues now. It's really been this wonderful enterprise with very rich, interesting people. And for being a part of that, I consider myself very privileged. Okay, so now in terms of Camus. It occurred to me maybe I should mention just a little bit about what motivated me to write the book, other than the fact that Blackwell approached me and asked me to do it, which probably would have been good enough. But I thought about it because I'm not really Camusian. I take my philosophical cues in some sense from other quarters. But Camus, for me, occupies a very, very interesting position, both personally and philosophically. I mean, he was one of the characters that brought me to philosophy. I could say, and I say it only half jokingly, that he was probably the first individual who was concerned with questions of distributive justice that didn't understand those concerns in terms of hitting the right person on the fast break and distributing the ball properly. I mean, it was really that early in my life that I came to him. And what struck me about him that early, and this is when I was in high school, when I really wasn't a particularly interested student, was not just the stands he took, but the life that he had lived. And what really caught my imagination was the fact that he was a man who was in his 30s, who was the editor-in-chief of Combat. The Nazis were after him. They were trying to find out where he was. They were all looking to kill him. And with this equanimity, this young guy is just running this newspaper that really had an enormous effect on the people who were in occupied France at the time. Camus' life itself, it seemed to me, there was something right about it. A second thing that brought me to Camus and really sort of clinched the deal in terms of my doing the book was the fact that while in many ways I disagree with various of Camus' positions, in fact, I have deep problems with both the Myth of Sisyphus and with The Rebel, which are basically his two philosophical essays, more importantly, there seems to me something right about Camus. Everything he does crackles with a kind of ethical intensity, and it occurred to me that in various places, in various ways, his life was exemplary, perhaps not in terms of being able to articulate his ethical position in appropriate philosophical terms, but the fact that he seemed to adopt the right positions, at least as far as I was concerned. And it's not just me who thinks that. One of the great moral philosophers of the 20th century was Bernard Williams, and I don't think many people would dispute that. Williams was an absolutely superb philosopher, and Williams himself, I saw similar things in Camus. If you look at his work, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, he opens it with a quote from The Fall. Clement stating, when one does not have character, one must give oneself a method, which in many ways was a concern that had animated Williams throughout his career. Secondly, when you get to Williams' work, Truth and Truthfulness, he talks about the importance of the intellectual as someone who has the courage to speak everyday truths. And he points out in Truth and Truthfulness that Camus was seen to have a sort of fatuous humanism. He was not considered a particularly good philosopher, and he'd been attacked in a number of ways. But his moral standing came from somewhere else. It came from the positions that he adopted in a very complex society, one in which there were all sorts of perils, and this guy just was undaunted. And he was a great man. And for all of these reasons, it occurred to me, maybe I should write a book on Camus and try and do some sort of philosophical reconstruction in which I can make sense of what I see as the best in Camus in terms that I think he didn't always put it in. And so, to first lay out a bit of what I did in the book, and I think that was well done by my colleagues on the panel, but I would add a couple of things, and then to respond to certain concerns of theirs. As Paul and Fred both rightly point out, I had enormous problems with the way in which Camus lays out the notion of the absurd in the Myth of Sisyphus, and the problems stem from the fact that he understands it in metaphysical terms. In fact, I mean, it's very interesting. Nagel, I think, rightly says that in some ways that position, the position in the Myth of Sisyphus, the position of the absurd, poses a religious question without a religious answer. And it's not clear to me that Camus always understood himself to be doing that, at least in the sense that he saw himself as an atheist. But in fact, he was a traumatized atheist of sorts, and God was always hanging around in the background, early and late in The Rebel as well. Where I find the absurd most interesting, as both Fred and Paul pointed out, was in the context of the phenomenology. Because at the end of the day, Camus' experience is one that really does resonate with us. And it resonates for a variety of factors. But my concern with Camus, and it's one that's reflected both here and is reflected later on when you deal in The Rebel, is that rather than move downstream from this sort of phenomenology, from this experience of absurdity, and looking at the socio-historical mediations that might be engendering it, what Camus does is move upstream towards a metaphysics that it seems to me is untenable given his own positions. And so that's something I try and make clear throughout the course of my book. Now, what we get, and I want to respond to Deborah momentarily, but I'm on a roll here, so I'll come back to you momentarily, okay? What we get with the novels, in particular Meursault in The Stranger and Clemence, are what I call purified phenomenological portraits. And in many ways, I think some of Deborah's criticisms were right in terms of what she takes to be going on there. But it seems to me that there's a response that can be made, and I'll bracket those for a moment. But why do I deal with these two characters? At the end of the myth of Sisyphus, Camus says that there are basically two ways of surmounting the absurd. He says, on the one hand, Sisyphus makes his rock his thing, which in many ways is this notion of you immerse yourself in life. Sisyphus, when he makes his rock his thing, isn't standing back and looking at the horror of what he's been condemned to, which is to ceaselessly roll a boulder up a mountain, but he gets into it. And so getting into it or immersing yourself in life is one way to respond to the problematic that is the absurd. On the other hand, there's the notion of scorn. And it seems to me in many ways what you've got with these two characters, Meursault and Clemence, are these extremes of immersion in life and, on the other hand, standing outside of life and scorning. But one of the problems is, it seems to me, is that when you take these two positions, they're both one-sided positions. And there's this interesting, I mean, at least for me, one of the interesting things phenomenologically is there's always this sort of complex relationship between lived experience on the one hand and reflection on the other, right? The notion is, I think it was Sartre, and actually maybe Kierkegaard, who says there's either living or telling. You can't do both. Is this? I thought it was Kierkegaard too, right? The notion here is, well, what is your distance in terms of how you approach life? When you immerse yourself in life, one of the claims I wanted to make through Meursault was that immersion precludes even the sorts of sensible experiences that Camus thinks Meursault makes good. Because if you read The Stranger carefully, all of Meursault's sensual responses are completely atomized and can't even make good the notion of a real sensual experience, which is ostensibly what you get when you immerse yourself in life. And the reason for that, it seems to me, is that reflection is always a part of making sense of those sensible experiences. So there's this complex dialectic between experience and reflection. Look from the standpoint of Clemence. Clemence completely pulls himself out of life, and it's this sort of game, it's sort of like the fun house with these constant mirrors of reflection, but there's nothing about lived life that's being captured in this, and of course this itself is not a reasonable response to the problem of the absurd. So Camus, it seems to me, recognizes this, and he recognizes this in two relatively unlikely places. In his play Caligula, which was written at some point later, he has this interesting character called Chiria, who is taking on Caligula, who is basically outraged innocence, which turns toward nihilism. And there is some connection there. I don't have the time to spell it out. But Chiria has this line where he speaks to Caligula, and he says, well, you know, everything you say is logical and valid, but it's not sound. And that seems to me really a nice sort of way of putting it, because the notion here is that if you buy into the premises of the argument of the absurd, it cashes out into a sort of nihilistic comportment that you get with Caligula. But it's not sound, it seems to me, because the premises are wrong. In some sort of hazy sense, Chiria recognizes this, and he moves off the dime and takes a moral position. So too in Letters to a German Friend, written while Camus was at combat and was edited in the paper. he comes to recognize, and I think with some degree of concern, that the absurdist position is one that in many ways would seem to countenance virtually anything. And when he writes letters to a German friend, it seems to me in some sense he's almost looking to distance himself from himself, insofar as he recognizes that there is this sort of nihilistic impulse perhaps in the absurd, the notion being that there are no real qualitative distinctions to be made. And at the end of the day, why shouldn't his own absurdist position cash out in Nazism just as easily as it cashes out in fighting against Nazism? And I think he recognizes he doesn't have enough there to really make that principal distinction. He moves off the dime, it seems to me, and then he moves toward the notion of solidarity, which you get in The Plague. And so this is really what I take to be what I call his Kantian turn. And so what do I mean here by a Kantian turn? Right? If you look at Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, at the end of it, he's made good science. In a way, he's made good science for us. And the notion is he's made good Newtonian physics, which crowds out any notion of freedom, any notion of an efficacious subject. But then when he moves to his practical philosophy, to a different sort of perspective. He talks no longer about the laws of nature, but he talks about the laws of freedom. And he says, from a practical standpoint, what we need to do is understand ourselves as operating under the idea of freedom, bracketing what the metaphysical fact of the matter is, which is something that Kant actually does say in a footnote in the third section of the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. I think Camus himself recognizes that at the end of the day, you need to make sense of how to live. To maintain that sort of theoretical standpoint you get with the absurd isn't sufficient for practical purposes. He makes a turn in that sort of way, and now all of a sudden a different sort of practical problematic opens up for him, and the absurd comes to function somewhat differently. Now, it seems to me Camus moves toward a particular sort of ethics here, and as Albert rightly pointed out, it's not utilitarian. Camus is not a calculator, although I find certain interesting resonances in positions that, say, Peter Singer has taken that were in Camus. I do think he moves toward what Albert rightly pointed out, and what I suggest in the book, is an agent-focused virtue ethics. And in particular, I think what's going on with Camus, and again, as Albert had pointed out, is what he's confronted with is how to make sense of ethics. And what I call this is a kind of phenomenological ethics, which is all that's left after virtue ethics, which depends in some sense on social life, has broken down. And there are a number of ways of making sense of a phenomenological ethics. At the most basic, it seems to me, it means being open to a particular sort of experience. And being open to a particular sort of experience is crucial for the purposes of a particular sort of moral perception or seeing that enables you to adopt what it would be properly called a human standpoint. So what do I mean by this, and what is a phenomenological ethics? Let's take an example of someone who can't engage or doesn't have an ethics of this sort. Take someone who's quite literally a sociopath. And by a sociopath, I mean someone who, when there's this kind of mental imaging and they're shown all of these sort of horrible sort of scenes, nothing is lighting up. Literally, the brain is not responding in the way that it ought to be responding. And what I take a phenomenological ethics to be is an ethics that's grounded in some sense, and I want to use the word carefully here, in a notion of human nature. If you don't have a nauseating experience of seeing someone's bones cracked in front of you or doing this horrible violence, there's something not quite human there. And it seems to me for Camus, this phenomenological ethics is necessarily a starting point when a more elaborate virtue ethics is broken down by virtue of the breakdown of social life, which is basically the situation in which he had found himself. So, Camus moves into the rebel. A lot of the arguments there are not particularly good. I mean, Albert, forgive me. I don't think they're particularly good. I think, you know, in many ways, and it's funny because this book has been reviewed in a number of places and in a number of places in France, and they always think I'm sort of categorically supporting Camus' position, which really isn't true. There are deep problems in Camus' position. Camus' critique of Hegel is wrong. His critique of Marx is wrong. His attempt to continue to talk about this notion of metaphysical revolt, which gives rise to all the problems with Saint-Janssen and the characters of L'État moderne, he was wrong there too. What he was right about in The Rebel was an absolute refusal to tolerate Stalinism, to refusal to tolerate violence, an attempt to revivify ethics in a particular sort of way. And he does this in a very interesting fashion, because what I've argued in the book is that he looks to cut this sort of fine line between what we would understand in today's virtue ethics debates. Because on the one hand, he has this agent-focused account, and that's right. But the concern here is well, firstly, actually, let me step back for a moment. There are two legs, basically, in virtue ethics, and I'm being rather crude here. There's this sort of McIntyrean leg, which emphasizes the sort of, is more conservative and emphasizes the nature of the polis as a condition of possibility and ethical life no longer being possible because the sort of polis you get with Aristotle is no longer possible. Camus not about that. You get another leg where you're dealing with people like Philippa Foot and Rosalind Hursthouse, and I think Bridget Clark is really part of this world as well, where you're talking about a notion starting from the standpoint of human nature and making sense of practical reason on the basis of the kinds of rational animals that we are. And it seems to me that's where Camus is coming from, and he can be well framed in terms of the contemporary virtue ethics debates. Now, there's this interesting response to Nietzsche in the virtue ethics debates. I mean, the only thing I think that McIntyre and Foote would agree upon is that Nietzsche is somehow deeply problematical in terms of any sort of getting any sort of strong ethical notion off the ground. Let me bracket McIntyre's position. Foote is very concerned about Nietzsche's individualist ethics, and I think rightly so. But Foote then talks about various sorts of things like truth and promise-keeping and all of these things as being fundamentally necessary for the kinds of beings that we are. And I think she pushes it too strong and brings in a sort of deontological impulse through the back door of her virtue ethics and her notion of flourishing. And so you would have people like Marx, for example, who, when he responded to the British economists who talked about human nature as involving greed and acquisitiveness, Marx would say, well, we're only greedy and acquisitive under capitalism. Under a different system, maybe not. Nietzsche would have had a similar sort of critique. Camus, it seems to me, splits the difference between the sort of account you get with Foote and the account you get with Nietzsche. He, too, is deeply troubled by Nietzsche's agent-based account to virtue ethics. He thinks that there's got to be some sort of rule structure against, crudely, the Übermensch running wild. On the other hand, he has problems, I would think he would have problems concerning Foote's position, which brings too much of the deontological through the back door of a sort of human flourishing account. What Camus offers, and this took some amount of reconstructing on my part, is really a two-tiered ethical analysis. On the one hand, he talks, and I don't know that it's particularly strong, but he offers this notion in The Rebel, I rebel, therefore we exist. And what he's looking to do is essentially broaden out from the solitary individual that he deals with early on in The Absurd to a notion of rebellion that encompasses all of us. And I mean, it would take a lot of work to make this good, and I don't have the time to do it here, but I think one of his impulses is basically right. In the notion of I rebel, therefore we exist, is the notion that insofar as you want to say no, right, which is what's involved in rebellion, and you want to carve out some sort of alternative ethical comportment, then in some sense, you're expecting others to give you the space that you in turn need to give them for the purposes of pursuing this endeavor. And that's this very thin notion. And I think that's the initial general impulse. And then after that, Camus wants to leave it up to ethical life itself to determine the particulars. So on the one hand, he's not going to give you as thick an account as someone I think like Foote wants to give you in terms of packing in various rules and concerns into the flourishing account. On the other hand, he's going to reject the agent basing of Nietzsche, and he carves this nice middle position, it seems to me. Now, he needs to do a lot of work that he doesn't do, but he needs to show how this principle, in some sense, can hold off the worst concerns that people like McIntyre and especially Foote have concerning a particular sort of individual-based virtue ethical account without, on the other hand, simply collapsing into bringing all of the conventional ethical presuppositions through the back door. Finally, it seems to me, I talk a fair bit about Nietzsche, about Camus and the debate with Sartre and over the question of praxis. And this is a question that has always interested in me, and I think you get a really good example of the problem of praxis in the fight between Camus on the one hand and the people at Les Temps Modernes, which was Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Merleau-Ponty, all of whom ended up coming over to Camus' position in terms of the repudiation of the Soviet Union, but much later. 5 minutes? But much later. And one of the interesting things is, I think these guys had it right. You know, as Raymond Aron had put it, I don't know what the fuss is. These guys basically have the same position, and I front one of the chapters with that, and I think he's right. And it's a position that I've had since as early as I can remember. These guys were sort of democratic or libertarian socialists who believed in the notion of all sorts of rights and believed that these were fundamentally incompatible with the sort of society and capitalist society in which we now live. Neither one of them liked the false alternative between, on the one hand, sort of McCarthyism in American capitalism, and on the other hand, the monstrosities of the Soviet Union, Stalinism, and all the rest. And what was so interesting about this debate is it really looked at the problem of praxis. And while Camus was wrong in many respects in terms of his critiques of Hegel, Marx, and all the rest, I think he had it just right here in terms of the question of praxis. There's a division of labor within society, whether we like it or not. And one of the things that the individual, the intellectual, is confronted with is the obligation to tell the truth as best he sees it and not fold in with a particular sort of teleological story about why all sorts of things need to be justified or at least accepted for the purposes of realizing the ultimate ends, which never come. And so in the deepest sense, I thought Camus had it right, even though I thought many of the arguments had gone amiss. Now, let me pull off there and respond. Firstly, I want to thank Paul, who I'm not going to respond to because he just sort of faithfully gave an overview of what he was saying, and it was quite faithful, so I have no quibbles. Thank you, Paul. As far as Fred is concerned, one of the things that I really dislike about the contemporary context is this sort of bad psychologizing, which is usually the resort of, it seems to me, a washed-out mind that doesn't want to encounter the philosophical problems. And so what do? You move in, you psychologize, and you deconstruct, oh, this is why this person is coming from this position. And that's a temptation I didn't want to engage in. But in response to Fred's question, why Camus' Cartesianism, the absent God? And it seems to me that you really can see this in Camus' biography. He grew up in this hard-scrabble existence, the poverty-stricken areas in Algeria, and his mother was deaf, his father was dead, and in many ways one could imagine with a deaf mother and a sort of overbearing grandmother and virtually no one else, the universe would begin to look a bit indifferent from that standpoint. Also, he had enormous commitments to the individual. And the fact of the matter is, I don't want to juggle Descartes completely out of the story because Descartes does at least some work in terms of his demand that all individuals, by virtue of sort of, maybe it's God's bequest, but there's the well-distributed notion of reason or the light of reason that we all have. And this is something that the French took seriously and I take seriously as well. I think he's overly Cartesian, and this is problematical, but there's the response to Fred. In terms of Deborah, well, you gave me a lot. And let me say, I mean, in terms of Nussbaum, I think a number of the things, right, that Nussbaum was talking about are right in terms of making sense of the novel, right? You want a particular sort of a particularity, you want some emotive appeal, you want descriptions that aren't cooked. But where I really jump off the boat is you want a participant and you want a friend. And I think that's wrong. I don't think it's the obligation of the novelist to provide somebody who's a friend or someone who you can sympathize with or a participant. I mean, there's always been this interesting question, it seems to me, in terms of the nature of art. The relationship between, on the one hand, art for art's sake, and the other hand, the notion of committed art. And the problem is both of these sort of reflect two sides of a coin, neither one of which really does justice to the deeper problem concerning what precisely the work of art ought to reflect. Now, should we make our work of art committed so it resonates with people, and there'll be participants, and the people of our society can see what we're talking about? And it seems to me there's too much of a conventionalism that's built into this notion. The idea here is that our art ought to clarify, art ought to be able to provide, if not in itself, I mean, there's nothing transcendent, to be sure, about either Camus or Meursault, but what both of these characters point to, it seems to me, is the demand for a particular sort of transcendence that these characters can't make good. In a certain sort of way, we might talk about both Camus and Meursault as forms of consciousness. And what Camus is probing are these forms of consciousness, to use the Hegelian term, for the purposes of showing that they don't work. There's a fundamental breakdown. They're incoherent on their own terms, and it moves you to different sort of comportment. And if art is performing that sort of work, it seems to me it's performing its task. You know, you look at Picasso's Guernica. There's nothing pleasing or exciting or friendly or warm and fuzzy about it. But what it captures is a particular sort of horror that requires us, we recognize a particular sort of ethical commitment to move beyond the situation in which you can produce Guernicas, or you produce these sort of people like Camus and Meursault who are struggling incoherently to make sense of a modern predicament that they really can't make sense of. Finally, Albert. I think Albert was right in terms of the notion that we need certain rights and liberties packed into our framework. And while I didn't have the chance to pursue it in our book, the thing I would have argued, Albert, was I think Camus recognizes that with that first order principle, or that transcendent principle of I rebel, therefore we exist. Now, obviously that requires an enormous amount of work, but I think the recognition of the first order principle, and not simply permitting us to sort of move into the movement of ethical life, was his recognition that there are certain rights and liberties that must attach to the individual for the purposes of making ethical life possible. And I think that in some sense he thought he would be able to give those boundary principles, or at least I think he thought, or at least I'm attributing to him the notion that this I rebel, therefore we exist gets at some of those concerns. Thank you.
Well, we only went 5 minutes over what we were scheduled, which is really good. So the reason we limited the time was that you can engage, and since there's 5 people up here, I'll serve as the moderator and call on people. I think that'll be easy. But go ahead. I think a lot of interesting ideas were put on the table. I'd like to hear from you and engage with our speakers. And so please. Or did we leave you speaking? Also, this can go between you guys as well.
Did you want to raise? Did you want to come back to me, Deborah, in terms of some of the questions that you raised?
Well, I'll give people an opportunity out there first. There must be some questions.
Hey, troops, somebody's got to break the ice, you know. Whoever is that, the first question.
All right.
All the others will come. So, who's going to?
I'm wondering if you could couch this in a little bit more popular terms. How would you explain to somebody who's, say, 22, lives in Montana, and studies here why they should be interested in Camus?
I will say, and I have some students here who I hope will testify to this fact. I teach existentialism, and Camus does seem to resonate with my students. So, I mean, I'll start from that standpoint. Why do I think Camus should be able to resonate? You know, there's something very interesting about the existentialist movement, and it was supplanted. And one of the interesting things is a commitment to individuality and the notion of the individual. I mean, the American culture prides itself, I'm not quite sure how justifiably, but prides itself on the notion of a kind of rugged individuality, and that the individual is in a position to come to make fundamental determinations about his or her life that values are up to us in a particular sort of way. And this seems to me, at least in some sense, to be something, at least historically, that was ingrained in the society, and something that I think philosophy has left behind. I really appreciate a number of Albert's comments that philosophy has, in many areas, become sterile, it's become passionless. And what I want to add is it's not only the case on the Anglo-American side, but I think it has also been the case on the other side of the, on the other side of the ocean. I really don't have an enormous amount of sympathy for what is known as post-structuralism, and and my concerns with it vary depending upon which thinker you're talking about. But all of these people, what they share in common is they lose that sort of phenomenological or first-person standpoint. Here I am. There's a choice to be made. What is it that I ought to do? I mean, this seems to be something that's peculiarly American, and insofar as it's something that resonates less and less with our students over time, which may be the case, so much the worse for us, and so much the worse for a society in which these questions are no longer front and center in the way they were 30, 40 years ago. Is that?
Being a Montanan, it's like you, was first interested in philosophy, although I had the unusual Montana experience of growing up in Butte, and Butte people don't refer to themselves as Montanans, but as beauties. It seemed to me, and anyone who grew up in the post-war 40s and 50s, as I did, certainly the experience of the absurd was a daily experience when you were looking at the possibility of nuclear annihilation. And it seems to me that anyone who's living in the present era and who's in their 20s or 30s is certainly facing the absurd on a constant basis. Our politics has collapsed. Sanity has no name whatsoever in the public arena any longer. And to live in a kind of beautiful and interesting place like Montana, where some of our politicians still have some reasonable sanity, and not recognize that the world has gone mad. And the question always was, like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, nobody paid any attention to them in the 19th century. When World War I came and the whole damn world blew up in their faces, they said, geez, what happened? And they went looking back into the 19th century, and there were these two voices who sort of knew, the time was out of joint. And it seems to me, I read Camus the first time when I was 15, and he and Sartre were the first people, and Nietzsche, who spoke to what I experienced as my condition, even though I was living in Montana and was supposed to be much more naive than that. But I don't think Montana kids are naive. I've been teaching here for over 40 years, and the most brilliant students I've had have come from little places like Big Sandy and Webo, etc. And they grew up on farms. And I asked the kid from Big Sandy, who was the best philosophy major I think we ever had, I said, how do you get there out of Big Sandy? My best friend was from Big Sandy, and he was a polymath. He could do everything. And he said, well, in Big Sandy, he said, you got a lot of time to think. He said, you look out, you see all that empty sky, and he said, what do? He said, you think. He said, it's almost impossible not to grow up thoughtfully if you live in a place like that. Plus the fact Camus has the lyricism. How many philosophers could ever write as well as he does? Read his lyrical essays. Some of them are just travel essays. They're magnificent.
Did English language philosophy have any influence on Camus?
None. I think absolutely
English
not.
language novels.
Yes.
I vaguely recall
yes, Hemingway.
With James Cain.
Well, Hemingway absolutely
Yeah,
did.
Hemingway.
Because if you look at The Stranger, it's very much patterned on the Hemingway style, the sort of short clip sentences. Now, I mean, what's so interesting about the way in which The Stranger is set up is that these short clip sentences it's not Camus style, but it's the style that one who is not self-conscious and lives in the moment, and there's no continuity from moment to moment, would adopt these short, quick, punctuated style. But in fact, it was very much Hemingway. but it's mostly European influences, I would have to say. Kafka was huge. Dostoevsky was huge. I mean, these are the people that really informed the way in which Camus thought about these things, but Hemingway was there.
So I look at figures like Montaigne and like Camus, and it's like they started a truck, they put a brick on the accelerator, and they just let the vehicle go. And some of the intellectual traditions we have now have been trying to steer that vehicle, or if nothing else, take the brake off the gas and try and set a direction or set an end point. And that's where we get this feeling where some of us enter into the academic realm and say, why are we trying in the first place? We've lost that motivation to even be engaged with conversation. So I guess the question is, how do we incentivize that conversation, like what Camus did and what like Nietzsche did, and how they provided that language to engage people, to inspire the pathos of the situation.
Well, I mean, this is an enormously difficult question. I mean, how do we do that? If I had the answer to that one,
You'd be president.
I mean, one of the things I think one of the things that at least I look to do, I mean, how well I do it is obviously up for grabs, but there's something about, I really think many of the basic liberties, many of the basic sort of concerns that we've inherited from prior centuries are going by the wayside. The concern with the individual. I mean, I really think most of the democracies in the world are under enormous attack in a particular sort of way, and I think that there are all sorts of reasons for this, not the least of which is the manufacturing of a particular sort of opinion, or, I mean, actually, to use the name of, say, Chomsky's book, there's a particular sort of manufacture of consent, and there's this sort of, everybody comes together, and on the one hand, we have this sort of postmodern society in which you have these sort of rampant subjectivities and everybody's going off and doing their own thing, but when you sort of step back, you recognize that these are sort of impotent subjectivities, and everybody doing the same thing looks remarkably the same. And so, if there's anything to grab onto, I think there's still lip service that's paid to the notion that that we are rugged individualists of a sort. And when you can hold a mirror up to people and show them that this is not quite what you are, this is not quite what your society is about, it gives them some sort of space to move around, to sort of rethink who they are and the society is on their own terms. But I really do think that all sorts of social and historical events will conspire against this, which is why it's all the more imperative in some sense, right?
David, I remember a philosopher saying about Santayana that Santayana believed there is no God and his mother is Mary. And
I'm sorry, I missed the end of that.
There is no God and his mother is Mary.
Ah.
You know, and I almost wonder if Camus is like that, in a sense that, you know, what is he seems like very religious in many, many ways. And I was just wondering about the significance that, you know, as an atheist that is a believer in many ways.
Well, I mean, I think, to be honest with you, and I spend a fair bit of time in the book going over this, I think Nietzsche had it just right. Nietzsche talks about what he, right? I mean, everybody knows Nietzsche's statement, God is dead. In fact, Nietzsche was not the first to utter that. If you look at Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, Hegel says God is dead. I mean, this was something that was popping around. Nietzsche was not the first one to say this. What Nietzsche was the first to recognize was what this means in terms of how our world is constituted. And what he talks about as the shadows of God problem is sort of the recognition that even as in some sense everybody knows with that sort of cynical modern consciousness that God is dead, not everybody realized what that means in terms of the underpinning of our social, ethical, and political institutions. Camus himself fundamentally philosophized in the shadow of God in some sense. And the question becomes, well, how do you get beyond that? And secondly, what would it mean to get beyond that, and do we really even want to get beyond that? Because Nietzsche was of two minds with respect to getting beyond the shadows of God problem. I mean, on the one hand, there were the few to whom Nietzsche always spoke, and for him, the sort of concerns that Foote had were not concerns at all, because once ressentiment is purged and you're talking about the few to whom Nietzsche's talking about, it would go without saying that you don't engage in these sorts of random acts of violence. Nietzsche's concern was, however, with the majority who understand themselves as being required to be moral only because there's a God with some ultimate punishment or reward. And his enormous fear was, well, what's going to happen when these people come to recognize not only that God is dead, but recognize that all of our institutions, our ethical and our political institutions, are built on that absent throne. And what Nietzsche saw was nihilism. And in many ways, it seems to me he was right, and we're living that out. And the question becomes, how do you reconstruct values? I have no particular desire to do it on Nietzsche's terms. I think Nietzsche was much more interesting as a diagnostician than someone who was offering any sort of positive responses to this problem. But the notion is, you do it slowly, you do it tentatively, and you do it seems to me, as an initial matter based upon the presupposition that individuals are autonomous and their intelligence needs to be respected, and you need to deal with them in that sort of way so that they can come to a particular sort of ethical and political understanding that would be a lot more solid than one that's based upon a manufacture of consent. Even if consent is manufactured in the right sort of way. You don't want a society of automatons. And so I think these guys have something to tell us in terms of going back to basics. Whether that's historically possible at this point is a different matter.
I wonder what you would make of this comment by Octavio Paz, the great Mexican writer who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, great thinker in his own right. This was in his autobiography, Itinerary, and he referred to Camus as having the fine touch of uniting moderation with revolt. And I wonder if you have any idea of what
I think
might have meant.
Yeah, I forget the quote exactly, and I think it's attributed to Pascal. But if you look at the beginning of The Rebel, he talks about the ability to touch both extremes from the middle, which is simply another way of talking about what you're saying. And it seems to me, I mean, I think Albert had it dead to rights. I mean, Camus writes with both a particular sort of passion and a particular sort of concern. Now having said that, there are limits, and there are philosophical limits, because truth be told, Camus wanted it all. He wanted a kind of liberalism and a kind of republicanism. I mean, what Camus was looking to do in some sense is to sort of span all of those dualities that structure many of the social, ethical, and political debates. And of course, philosophers who focus in and are doing some of the harder, closer work are going to point out all sorts of reasons why that can't be spanned so well. And I think that work is important. And so you certainly don't want to relegate, throw that kind of work out in favor of passionate, committed intellectuals. Again, there's got to be a division of labor. But again, the pendulum has swung too far to the other side. And the problem is that we don't have enough Camus. I mean, the Camus are a necessary but not a sufficient condition for properly philosophizing the present age. We need the closer work, but it also needs to be inspired in a particular sort of way. And that, I think, as Albert rightly pointed out, is disappearing.
So it was a judgment on his politics.
I'm sorry, now?
It was a judgment on his politics. The reasonable man, the moderate man, would be in rebellion in highly ideological time. Or maybe,
Well, but see, this is where it's very difficult, though, for Camus, however. I mean, Camus is very conflicted about rebellion, historical rebellion. I mean, he follows these two lines in The Rebel. And again, I think not well done. I mean, he has sort of metaphysical revolt, which is a good part of the work, and then historical revolt. And because he's still operating from a particular sort of Christian standpoint, he can't tolerate, I mean, the people he holds up are the Russian terrorists and who else was it? There's one other. Because these were people who were willing to take their own lives in response to taking the lives of others, and therefore hold up the notion of recognizing everything is not permitted. But on the historical landscape, this is deeply problematical. I mean, Camus was critiqued, and I think rightly, by people, for example, when he came out with The Plague, which was a metaphor for the Nazi occupation, which is, you're making it too easy on yourself. Everybody can get behind the sanitation squads to do away with the notion of the plague. But once you become a resistance fighter, every step is fraught with moral peril, and there are all sorts of things that need to be weighed. Innocent people will die, and there are all sorts of complexities that, in some sense, I don't know that Camus' framework was up to making sense of. Yeah.
In the appendix to the myth of Sisyphus, Camus writes that the whole art of Kafka consists in forcing the reader to reread. Can you say this about Camus?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and not surprising insofar as Kafka certainly served as a model for Camus very much. I think one of the books, I mean, I talked about Hemingway's style. One of the books that informed the way in which Camus thought about The Stranger, in particular the second part of The Stranger, was Kafka's The Trial. Because in some sense, right, that's what Marceau goes on trial in the second half of the book. And the question is, what exactly is being put on trial for? And he's being put on trial, or as I put it in the book, he's not being put on trial for legal reasons, because truth be told, the argument could be made that he pulled out the gun and killed in self-defense. He's arguably not even being put on trial for moral reasons, because again, I mean, I think there are certain arguments that could be made why that could be accepted, but it's more of a trial with respect to a kind of existential guilt, and in particular, right, this is the sort of theme that resonated in a fair bit of Kafka's work, and it's what I think Camus is looking to make good in the second half of The Stranger. It would take too long to sort of go into why, but that is something I do suggest in the book.
In the back, yes.
Hi. I'm not sure that I can articulate this very well, and I guess maybe I'm just kind of hoping that you can articulate it more eloquently and clearly than I can myself. Just regarding some of the thoughts I'm having, I'm really interested in the fact that Camus is so well known for his novels. As a professional philosopher, he was very comfortable communicating in that medium, in contrast to a lot of professional philosophers who tend to write professional philosophy. Of course, he wrote essays as well, but I'm just curious, and I've been kind of struggling in my mind with questions regarding how that relates to, well, I suppose why you feel that he was so comfortable doing that, why he chose that medium, how that might relate to the question that was posed earlier about him speaking to us, speaking to present generations, and perhaps the relationship of how his choice of medium is related to what he wanted to communicate. Maybe also what Professor Borgman earlier said about him, or some of these philosophers of that generation having passion in ways in which maybe some modern philosophy kind of has lost or just lacks. And I wonder how those things are related. Maybe you can kind of elaborate on some of that.
Maybe since that's the last question, David and
Yeah, and I'll be happy to throw it out to other people on the panel. Well, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that I think it's a mistaken assumption that what Camus was fundamentally a philosopher, and he was a philosopher in search of a medium, and he alighted on a particular sort of the novel in a particular sort of form with respect to the novel as the medium. I mean, I think what Camus was first and foremost a novelist by temperament, and I think, right, I mean, he did get an advanced degree in philosophy, but he was that secondarily. I mean, one of the things that Camus does emphasize and is important to him is the fact that you want to return to the lived experience. And philosophy really isn't up to the task, right? I mean, it seems to me that, you know, if you're dealing with a question about the philosophy of the novel, something's going to suffer. It's going to be either the philosophy or the novel. And you've got to take a particular sort of standpoint from which to approach these questions. And it seems to me that Camus was much more willing to let the characters do the talking. But this really opens up questions then I think that Deborah had raised earlier in terms of, well, how effectively does he do this, or is this just sort of bad philosophy in which you're really having one-dimensional characters who are toting a particular sort of philosophical line?
It would be bad novels that have these characters doing
right.
this. Yeah, not bad philosophy necessarily.
But, so, I mean, I'd like, if I can use your questions as an occasion to open up my dialogue with Deborah. I mean, I guess the question is, I took down a number of the criteria that you know, you had cited from Nussbaum, that she shows us certain things, or that the novel shows something. And I would want to argue that those novels do show something, or at least there are lessons to be learned from them. Do these characters have conflicting moral goods? I mean, they're not so much, or so it seems. But again, I think what Camus is doing there is looking at what he sees to be two particular sort of existential temptations of the modern age. And through the character, he's probing what kind of life do these particular sort of existential choices engender. And insofar as he does that, there is a certain kind of moral upshot here in terms of our recognition with respect to both of these characters that they're way off the beam. So the fact that they themselves don't reflect this sort of conflicted moral sensibility, it seems to me what they can do is open up for us a sort of self-examination with respect to our own conflicted moral sensibility, and we look at these potential options that, looked at in a much less extreme sort of way, really are things that people usually do. When people say, look, I don't want to think about this, I want to throw myself into my work and my career and I want to do this, this is in some sense not quite in the same form as Rousseau, but that sort of option of throwing yourself back into life. And it has untoward consequences, and on consequences it seems to me that you can see, although obviously not as poignantly as you do, for example, with Rousseau. So too you have people who sort of stand at a distance from life, who always take this reflective sort of higher level position with respect to life, in part because, you know, it's sort of that, you know, that diagnosis that Nietzsche made so well about having to have, you know, you feel badly about yourself and your prospects, you put yourself one up on life for the purposes of being able to look down on it. That, in some sense, is what Clemence is doing in a more extreme sort of way. And it seems to me these characters have something to tell us about the ordinary temptations that they represent in a more extreme form.
They're so off the beam, they're parodies. And they're not, I mean, and yeah, they're parodies. And they're not, it's just really strange to me that you would say that Rousseau has immersed himself in life in some way. He's a parody of someone, of the sensualist, I guess. And none of us, and that's not very interesting, I mean, really, because we immerse ourselves generally in life and we encounter interesting sorts of moral conflicts once we're immersed in life, and really interesting characters live there and we can learn from them. but not so much from the parody.
I hate to break this. This is an interesting conversation. We are out of time. I would like to say, though, that David was telling me this is the 50th anniversary of Camus' death. And I was having a lot of nostalgia sitting here. Like David, I had read Camus when I was in high school and in college. And all this was coming back. And I was saying, this is really interesting. And so I think David's done us a real service by, maybe contributing to a revival of Camus, a very important thinker. And I would also say that the UC bookstore is here. So if you're interested in picking up the book, which I think you might be, it's back here. So thank you all for coming, and let's thank our panelists.